Welcome back. This is the News Hour. Let's take a look now at some of the global stories that have caught our eye. With me in the studio to review them are actor and filmmaker Abigail Clay and journalist and editor Olivia Utley. Ladies, good to have you with me again. Olivia, let's start with you. 450,000 people taking part in a legal action, joint legal action, to demand compensation from Volkswagen. What's all that about?
Yeah, so this was a scandal which erupted in 2015 when it turned out that Diesel had been using some clever programming software to make it look as though the diesel cars that they were producing lower emissions than they actually were. And this was exposed. It's been going on for 6 years, I think, from 2009 to 2015. They've just been cheating the emissions targets.
So are these the drivers and the owners of the car then?
So what's interesting is this is a legal suit from both the drivers and the owners of the cars who feel that they've been damaged. But it's quite difficult to put a price on how they've been damaged because obviously they've been driving cars which they thought had lower emissions than they did. So the cars that they've been driving were more damaging to the environment, but quite hard to put a price on how that's damaged them specifically. Also, the shareholders who invest in Volkswagen and then saw the stocks absolutely plummet after this scandal erupted are also trying to get on this lawsuit. So everyone's trying to get money out of Volkswagen, basically.
How on earth is Volkswagen continuing to go after all this damage?
I like the irony that a company which translates as the people's car has completely betrayed all their consumers. I think there's a nice something in there. One thing that might beneficially come out of this is that Volkswagen are now trying very hard to push their electric car agenda.
Aren't they?
And so if
30 billion euros have invested.
And if they, you know, do stick to that, then it will force the other car companies to meet them where they're going. So it could be beneficial in the long run.
They might accelerate.
It's embarrassing for now.
Abigail, let's talk vaccinations. This is a story that you found about vaccinations in the UK that could be made compulsory.
Yes, it's an interesting thought. We need 95% vaccination rate in the UK to have what we call herd immunity.
So what do we have?
91.2 it is, which has gone down year on year, which is really worrying. And in Australia, they've introduced, it's not quite compulsory vaccination, but they've introduced a programme where parents who don't get their kids vaccinated don't lose out on welfare benefits. So that's one option. But yeah, this is even more extreme.
I mean, how is that going to work, making it compulsory? Are the public going to buy that?
So the Health Secretary is suggesting that you won't be allowed to go to school if you don't have your vaccinations, which I understand the concept because just because I've had my vaccinations and you haven't, for example, that will mean that you put me in danger as well.
Right.
However, I think people will, as always, if something's made illegal and they're forced into something, people will either not send their children to school and homeschool them, or they will find ways of getting around it. For example, some children can't have vaccinations for religious or medical reasons.
Right, I was going to ask, what are the reasons people don't vaccinate their kids?
There are medical reasons, like serious medical reasons, which is why it is so bad when the parents of healthy children don't vaccinate their kids, because then children with weak hearts, say, who can't get, or children who are too young to be allowed to have vaccinations, they're the ones who are put in danger when the parents of healthy children refuse to vaccinate. So obviously some parents can't vaccinate their children, and then there's been this just persistent myth that vaccinations cause autism, which was the result
MMR.
of the MMR. There was this paper that came out in the 1990s by a now completely discredited doctor.
Wakefield,
Andrew
name
Wakefield.
and shame.
Oh, name and shame, Andrew Wakefield, exactly, who wrote that MMR causes autism. And just the effects of that have just lingered on. Yeah. And now there's this online community of fake news spreaders on Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. There are these whole forums full of anti-vaxxers, as they're called, who just propagate this myth.
And it's not just in the UK, is it? Because we've seen in the US, they've had a resurgence of, is it mumps?
Measles.
And measles.
Yes.
And these childhood diseases that we thought we'd been
eradicated at the turn of the century.
Free of.
It's such a shame. You know, we were certified measles free, and now we have lost that according to the World Health Organization. So I think the the thing really that we need to do is make sure parents are educated, because I'm not sure how well forcing parents to act in the way you want to will work. And so it's all about really trying to tell people the dangers that are involved.
Let's move on to something a little more lighter-hearted. Olivia, 2,000 of France's finest restaurants will offer 2 meals for the price of 1 over the next fortnight. Sounds like a good deal. Why are they doing that?
Well, I think it's hilarious. It's these really, really, really posh, quite smug French restaurants, you know, where a meal for one is 295 euros a head or something. Yeah, sort of snobby, smug Parisian restaurants. 295 euros a head. But they feel that they're under threat by Deliveroo. They think that people are now sitting at home and want to get their takeaway, so won't go out to these really, really posh French restaurants. And I think that's an example of free market working at its absolute best. You've got these... Deliveroo has forced these French restaurants to lower their prices, essentially, because they feel threatened by
These are two entirely different experiences.
I mean, that's what I would have thought.
One is slobbing out on a sofa at home with your pizza,
and one is going and eating a Michelin-star restaurant. That's exactly what I thought. But these French restaurateurs are terrified by the threat of Deliveroo. I suppose there is something in the way that our eating habits are changing generally. And what we've seen in the UK, that a lot of mid-market restaurants are collapsing because fewer people are eating out because of things like Deliveroo. But I wouldn't have thought it would affect the sort of top culture French restaurants.
Is it all about junk food? Is it all about fast food outlets and the kind of things that we think of getting delivered by Deliveroo and Uber Eats and what have you tend to be the less healthy things, or is that a misconception?
I have to say, I don't think it is, although I could be wrong. But I think, you know, it is a good idea for restaurants to recognise, especially, as you say, this calibre of restaurant, to recognise the times we live in, and, you know, to encourage people to make an occasion of something, and we'll just have to see whether they can compete.
You were saying that the mid-range restaurants are going under. So isn't there room for the sort of the top end, your posh night out, special occasion type thing, and the I can't be bothered to cook, let's put something in?
Which is exactly the way I started living my life. I'll go out for a really, really nice
I still
meal.
live my life.
Really nice meal for my birthday, but, like, don't really bother with the sort of mid-market, middle of the week, can't be bothered to cook dinner. So I would have thought that these restaurants, the top culture restaurants, wouldn't be struggling that much. And actually, I think quite a lot of this is it's an old scheme, this 2-for-1 week, where the top restaurants offer 2 for 1. And it's actually quite it's a sort of charitable scheme. It's reaching out to allow people who normally wouldn't be able to afford to eat in France's top restaurants the chance to have that experience.
Should totally try it out.
Good for them, yeah.
And finally, let's have a look at our next picture, because this is Sandra. If we could have a picture of the lovely Sandra on the wall. That's Sandra. Sandra is under the blanket there. Sandra is an orangutan. Abigail, what is so special about Sandra?
So Sandra is the first non-human person, as she was described, to be afforded human rights. She was being held in a cage, essentially, and she's being moved to Florida, where she's going to have a much better quality of life. She had her baby taken away from her.
It's actually quite a sad story about Sandra, but it has a happy ending.
It's very sad, but it's nice to see that this wonderful creature is being given the respect she deserves and has moved to a happy home with much more...
This is quite interesting that she's been granted human rights.
Yes. And
by a court.
From the animal rights perspective, I think that's very encouraging. It is very important that we save particularly one of the most endangered animals on the planet. However, it does strike me as awful that this orangutan now has more human rights than many immigrants in the US.
Apparently she had trouble getting over the US border because of licensing and immigration controls. Does that surprise you?
I mean, ridiculous. Just sort of this story, it sounds like some sort of surreal, it sounds like a fake news story, but it's actually true. It's an orangutan who's been granted human rights and then had trouble getting over the US border. But yeah, as Abigail says, it's a sad story with a happy ending.
Are we going to see other animals getting human rights?
Well, I suppose. I was thinking that sort of sets a precedent, doesn't it? That judge's ruling. who knows where this is going to lead? What other animals will have sort of human rights? I think it's a good direction to be
Dog
moving
starts
in.
protesting that you've not let it out enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, now I think what's nice is that the zoo that she was kept in Argentina has now been shut down and it's being rebuilt as an eco park. So hopefully
good, yeah.
animals like Sandra won't be kept in poor conditions any longer. Ladies, thank you very much indeed for joining me in the studio. Great to get through some of those stories, and some of them are really quite eye-opening, aren't they? Thank you very much indeed for that, Olivia Utley and Abigail Clay.